In the previous course, we talked about the 4 core components of the first arc in an overall campaign. Those components were party union, world establishment, character development, and the plot hook, of course. I also talked about what my first arc of this campaign is going to be. In my first arc, just to recap, I'm going to split the party into 2 groups before we begin. Each of these groups will come up with a solution to the problem that is currently being faced by the port town of Kesset, where the first arc is going to take place. This first arc is going to be very roleplay focused, with a lot of diplomacy, espionage, and problem solving. This is going to give all of the characters a lot of opportunities to really flesh out their own personalities. But I also want to make sure that I give every player character an opportunity to shine. So if there are characters who are combat focused, I want to make sure that I have a couple of combat moments in here so that those player characters can shine, instead of just the ones who are very charisma based. I also want to make sure that this arc is setting up the villain of the broader campaign, which is the king of the region. You should have something similar to this in mind as you approach this part of the course. You should know roughly how your first arc is going to tackle each of the 4 components that make up the skeleton of the first arc that was discussed in the previous course. Know your plot hook, know how you're going to bring the party together, know how you're going to develop each of these characters, and know which parts of the world you want to establish right from the start. If you have the skeleton of your first arc ready to go, then we can dive into this session. In this session, we're going to flesh it out significantly. We're going to add all the things that we really need and even draft the first session. I'm going to discuss my process of fleshing out an arc and what it typically looks like going into the first session of a campaign. I'm also going to have examples of my typical outline that I use when I'm creating an arc and when I'm preparing for a session in particular, and you'll be able to use those to prepare for your own sessions. I'm going to provide examples of all of this on my website. You can use the link that I have in my description to go to the blog post that is associated with this video, and at the bottom of that will be a link to download the resources that I mention here. With all of that said, let's go ahead and dive into today's course. I break my campaigns into 4 core components. The broadest component is the arc, and then beneath the arc we have the session, and then under that is a beat, and then we have the scenes. In a much later course, I'm going to talk about creating the campaign, which has all of the arcs underneath of it. The campaign would be the overarching thing, like the outline itself would be called a campaign, and then you would have arcs within that outline. I'm going to talk about that in a much later session. Today, I just want to talk about one arc and how I break down a single arc and what each of these components means: session, beat, and scene. You should think of your campaign as a long series of books, each with its own self-contained story. Now, there's going to be one single long overarching story through all of those books, but each of the books you want to be somewhat self-contained and have a story from start to finish, a story that has a notable beginning and end. Each of these books is going to be the arc of your campaign, while your campaign itself is the entire series. In my current campaign that we're playing through, we're probably in the midst of book 3 or 4, but this is an especially long book and several plot threads have been appearing that are going to be resolved in later books or arcs. In fact, I even think that I would say that some of my earlier books were completely different genres from what I have now. Even though it's all horror and it's all taking place in Dungeons & Dragons, I started off with probably a murder mystery, and then I moved to the second book, which was a bit of a heist, and now we're in something akin to a portal fantasy. So these are very self-contained stories that all have these broader pictures and are even their own unique genres that stand apart from the other ones, but ultimately everything is cohesive and each session bleeds into the next. You can't necessarily tell when a particular book ends and when another one begins. So that's how you should think about the arcs. The arc is just a book that's part of the broader series. It can stand on its own and be unique. It can have a wholly unique cast of characters that are only going to appear in that particular book, but ultimately the arc is something that is self-contained and that tells a story from beginning to end. Next is the session. This one should be pretty straightforward to anybody who's an experienced dungeon master or game master. The session is just what you can do in a single sit down with your players. This means that session length and what all is contained within a session is going to vary based on you and your group. My sessions typically go for about 6 to 8 hours, so a single session in my outline is going to encompass enough content to make up that amount of time. More typically, I hear that sessions are about 3 to 4 hours long, although some people have 10 to 12 hour sessions on a regular basis. I used to, became a lot for me, but now I do 6 to 8, and so a session within my outline is about 6 to 8 hours of content. Now there's no way to guarantee you're going to get to all of that content in 6 to 8 hours, or that it's going to fill up that entire time slot. Oftentimes you're going to bleed over, so this is really just your best guess and you planning on how you want each session to go. This is especially useful if you can use your session planning and plan it perfectly so that you can end the session on a cliffhanger. I don't know if players enjoy that very much, but I personally enjoy it quite a lot. An important thing that I want to reiterate here is that there's only so much that you can do when it comes to planning the session itself. Role-playing games are role-playing games. That means that they are improvised. Things are going to change, and you cannot prepare for everything that your players are possibly going to do. You can try, you can do your best, and oftentimes, if you have players who are reasonable and who are not deliberately trying to derail you, you're going to be prepared for whatever it is that's going to come up. However, you can't necessarily expect that your players are going to completely fail at a puzzle and spend your entire 6-hour session in one room, or that your players are going to rock the puzzle's world and they're going to finish with it way sooner than you thought that they were, and now you have 4 hours of time that you need to fill and nothing prepared for it. So for me, I like to break it down in sessions, but I also prefer to prepare at least 2 or 3 sessions in advance, roughly, so I have a decent enough idea of what is going to come. But don't feel like you have to have everything planned down to the hour and that your players have to stick to your schedule and your regime. That's just going to throw things off and kind of take away from the fun of a game that's meant to be improvised. Within each session is what I call the beat. A beat is just a crucial moment within your session that contains multiple different scenes, or at least 1 or 2 scenes. For example, the first session of my current campaign had the following beats. The players meet, they shelter together from a blizzard, they find a corpse, they deal with the corpse, and then they return to the town. Each of these beats contained multiple different scenes and different sorts of challenges that just wouldn't have made sense to just have broken down in a long string of text, as opposed to breaking them down into this is a beat, this is a beat, and this is one. I'll also note that breaking a session down into beats makes it pretty easy to devise when a break is going to take place. I typically take my breaks about 4 hours into a session because I have 6 to 8 hour sessions. So at about the 4-hour mark, I generally try to have a beat end, and then we can move on and pick up where we left off with a new beat. Personally, when I'm planning out a session, I actually just write the arc and then I list out every beat that I want to take place. I don't break it down into sessions until later on, especially because session beginnings and endings can vary based on how long you actually spent in particular beats within the arc. I find it better to just list out all of the beats and then give an approximation of where each session is going to take place. This also makes it really easy to go in and add your scenes later on because you know what each beat is roughly seeking to accomplish for the story. The last component that I want to talk about is the scene. This is generally a skill challenge, combat, a room in a dungeon. Anything like that is going to be a scene and is going to have its own scene component written out. The story beat that I mentioned earlier from my first session, Sheltering from the Blizzard, had numerous different scenes in it. There were things like reinforcing the structure in which they were hiding, taking watch. I had a couple of dream sequences in there as well for the people who were sleeping to give them some information. Each of these was broken down into a unique scene. I wrote down what I thought skill challenges might be and what the difficulties were going to be for those skill challenges, and this fleshed out the beat very thoroughly so that instead of just having the player shelter from a blizzard written down and no notes on how that was going to look, I'd done all of my preparations in advance to ensure that this beat was something meaningful and that I knew in advance what challenges the players were going to experience. So those are the core components and how I tend to break down my outlines. You can use your own terminology if there's something that makes more sense for you, but these are the terms that I found are the easiest for me to use and make the most sense for me personally. Next, I'm going to actually talk about how I go about drafting the arc, although you might already have a pretty good idea of how I do that based on how I've described these components. So the very first thing that I do when I'm drafting an arc is I list out every single beat that I want to or expect to take place within that arc. Depending on the length of your arc, this could be a really long list. And for me, it's really just a scattering of ideas or even a storyboard of sorts. You might even consider starting out by just listing a bunch of beats on sticky notes and then reorganizing them how you want later on. I generally start out an arc with a picture in my head already of certain things that I really want to take place. For example, with this arc, I really expect to start seeing some of the aristocrats being hanged from underneath of that big, beautiful bridge that separates the island as a symbol of the suffering and oppression that the people of the mainland are enduring at the hands of the aristocrats who use the river and the bridge as a form of separation. I don't know when I'm going to put that particular beat in place, but I do know that I want to see it on there, so that's a beat that I'm going to list out, and I'll figure out where it goes later if I do manage to fit in something like that. So I start off by writing out all of these beats, tons of them, not even necessarily in a particular order. Additionally, I want to note that your beats are probably going to change as you play. While your players are going through your first arc, you're going to start seeing some things that you might have overlooked or some things that can now happen as a result of their actions. This initial list of beats that you're putting together for the first arc is just you making sure that you are as prepared as possible for what's to come. But don't expect to hit every single beat that you have listed here. A lot of them may be scrapped or changed as a result of player actions, and that's a good thing. That means that your players are impacting the story even in ways that you could not have previously foreseen. In fact, this is one of my favorite things about tabletop role-playing games, is we're playing out a story that I initially had a concept of, but that now has completely derailed, not because my players are deliberately trying to derail it, but because they're taking actions that I didn't expect, and now I have to improvise how the characters that I've put in place on my end are going to respond to what the players have done. This is going to change the beats and the scenes and the entire sessions as a result of player input, and I think that's a wonderful thing, and it's why we play role-playing games. So make your list of beats, but be prepared to not even hit half of them. I'm going to list all of the beats that I have for the first session in this arc. I'm not going to list every single beat that I might consider for this particular arc here, because that would take a long time. This first arc will probably have somewhere between 30 and 50 different beats that I could think of off the top of my head. So I'm just going to list the ones that I believe will make up the first session. Those beats are going to be: the first group moves through the town toward the meeting. The second group prepares the meeting place for the new arrivals. The two groups meet, introduce themselves, and start discussing solutions for the dilemma in Kesset. A fight takes place outside of the meeting place between a guard, seen as protecting the aristocrats of Kesset, and a few farmhands. The farmhands are willing to kill the guard who can't defend himself well against them. A mob kills a trader in the port who refused to give away the wool he had brought. A select few individuals who are accused of initiating the violence against the trader are sentenced to hang. Trading in Kesset, which it relies on, begins to slow down not just because of the mobs, but because of the increased fees on those who do business in the port, further threatening Kesset's ability to survive. Graffiti begins to appear on Soilu's crossing, typically portraying threats of death to the aristocrats on the Eight. These threats of death become more than threats when the bodies of two of the aristocrats are found hanging beneath the Great Stone Bridge. These are the 8 beats that I think would make up the first 1, 2, or even 3 sessions of this arc. As you can see, I begin ramping up the violence almost immediately. My current plan is for that first fight that breaks out between the farmhands and the guard to take place in the middle of the meeting that my players are having, interrupting it with a sudden show of violence and forcing them to take action, even if they haven't really decided what their approach to this problem is actually going to be. Blood will be spilled right from the start, and then matters will just continue to escalate until aristocrats are found hanging beneath the bridge. This is just going to get worse and worse over time, and the players will have to act and will have to do something, even if they aren't ready and even if they haven't really settled on an actual solution to the problem in Kesset. Then, when I prepare my sessions, I'm going to sit down and select which beats I want to take place in this next session. I'll also write out detailed scenes for each of those beats. For later sessions and later beats, I don't draft scenes, because I know I might not get to that beat and I might not get to those scenes, so there's not a point in putting a ton of effort into a particular beat that may never see the light of day. Instead, I focus all of my efforts on creating scenes for beats that I'm pretty confident are going to happen in the next session or the session after that. Of course, if I were planning to sell the adventure, then yes, I would put a lot of effort into each of the scenes and each of the beats, but because this is information that I'm relying on personally and that even my players don't have, there's no reason for me to go and flesh out every single beat when so many of them will probably not even happen. So with that in mind, I'm going to start writing out the scenes for a few of these beats that I expect to take place in the first session. The first beat is going to have one of the 2 player groups moving through the town. I'm going to take this opportunity to describe the town and describe how beautiful it is in spite of how ugly it actually is. You can see the beautiful mountains in the distance, you can hear the river, the sunset is gorgeous. This is a nice place to live, other than the fact that it's currently in turmoil. So I want to really make sure that I set the stage and set the tone with this first scene. Then I'm going to follow that scene up with a scene of them being interrogated by a guard. Even if the players are sympathetic toward the plight of the guards and the plight of the aristocrats, they are still going to be interrogated by this guard, and being interrogated by a guard when they were technically not doing anything wrong. At least I presume that they weren't doing anything wrong. Who knows? These are players we're talking about. They might just randomly kill somebody on the street. I don't know what's going to happen. But my goal is for the questioning and interrogation to come out of nowhere and help kind of shape the opinion of these player characters toward the guards and the aristocrats that they are trying to protect. I'm going to repeat this with the next beat, in which we have the players who are preparing the home for the arrival of the first group of players. These players all know each other, they're friends right now, they're cleaning, cooking, preparing wine or mead, whatever else they would normally be doing, and I'll have a list of a few possible activities that they could be conducting while they're preparing this home for the arrival of their guests. If there's a wizard, for example, there might be use of some magic to clean up dust and muck and that sort of thing off the floor and the furniture within the home. After a bit of that, I'll have another scene in which, once again, a guard approaches and interrogates them. There's a guard who's going door to door in the alley here, knocking on them, talking to people, asking them questions, and encouraging them to stay home tonight instead of going out and causing any trouble. This is intended to be a lot less intense than the interrogation of the first group, because this interrogation is going to be just a door-to-door thing that he's doing. He's going around, and yeah, it's a little unnerving and uncomfortable, but he won't be quite as aggressive with his questioning as the other guard was with the first group. The next beat that I have is the group meeting and discussing possible solutions. This is going to be a really easy scene for me to write because I'm really just writing a scene where they all meet. I'm going to give them opportunities to introduce themselves. I'm going to make a note for the scene that I just need to make sure that I go around the table and have each player introduce their character and talk about what it is that they're doing or what they look like, just to make sure that I really set the scene here. After that, the ball is really in the court of the players. There's no reason for me to mediate because there's no character that I'm portraying here. This is just the two groups bringing their different ideas for solutions to the table and talking about what it is that they want to do about the problem that is in Kesset. It is unlikely that they're going to have the exact same solution to this, especially because I would intend to give each group's slightly different information, just like each of the player characters would have different information. The players are going to have different information. So all of this combined is going to make for a lot of interesting conflict, and I would expect this to take up a pretty solid chunk of the session. Primarily with this beat, I'm just going to occasionally interject about how much time has passed while they're talking, and eventually I'll note that the sun has set or is beginning to set, and then it becomes dark and they have to light candles, things like that. I'm just there to narrate what the scene looks like and how the scene is changing as their discussions wear on. The beat that I want to end this session on is a fight taking place right outside of their meeting place. This is going to be the fight between the farmhands and the guard, and it's going to eventually turn into a mob, and now the players have to decide what they want to do. They are forced into some sort of action, even if that action is just closing the shutter so they don't have to see it and letting whatever takes place take place. How they approach the situation is going to help to determine what sort of attitude they have toward the problem that is being faced by the people of Kesset. They might go in and help the farmhands and the mob beat up this guard, or they may go in and help the guard. Either of these actions is also going to have an impact on how either side views them. If they go in and they help the mob, of course the people of the mainland are going to love this group and want to do whatever they say. If they go and help the guard, even if it's just to prevent a murder and break up a fight because they don't want to see bloodshed right now, even if their goals are positive and they don't even have a bleeding heart for the aristocrats themselves, they just wanted to prevent a murder, that's going to paint them in a very negative light of the people in the mob, who will then spread rumors that these people are sympathizing with the guards and the aristocrats regardless of their actual stances on these issues. This is going to be a very pivotal moment, and it's going to come like that and force them to make a decision and take action right then and right there. They might squabble, they might argue for a while, but they only have so much time before someone dies. This is a really intense note to end the session on as well. I don't want to end it as the fight is breaking out to give them a bunch of time to think about it later. I want to have them take action right then, try to resolve this conflict however they resolve it, be it through blood or through diplomacy, and then after that, they can spend the next 2 weeks thinking about what it is they did and wondering if they made the correct choice. One last thing that I want to touch on in this course while we're fleshing out our first arc is that I also like to write down a list of the characters and the places that are going to be important for the arc. This makes it easier for me to roleplay the characters and describe the scenes and settings later on when I need to reference them. This is something I tend to include in the same document that I have my session notes in, but you can include them wherever you like as long as you have them handy. We're not going to go through describing all of this right now because we're going to do that in a later course. In fact, next Monday, we're going to take some time to flesh out the setting of this arc a little bit more than we have before. In addition to that, I'm going to start adding shops and notable inhabitants in a later session a few weeks from now. So that's just a note of something that you need to be prepared for as well. In fact, I would recommend that right now you go through and make a list of all of the NPCs that you've created who are going to be relevant to this particular arc that you're writing. Additionally, make a list of all of the places that are going to be relevant. That doesn't just include settlement, it means all sorts of other things. For example, the home that my players are going to be meeting in this first arc is going to be a really important location that they're probably going to go back to. So I need to make sure that I have it referenced, listed, and have details written about it so that I can always reference that when I need it. Additional locations that could be important would be things like the guardhouses or the home of a family member of one of my player characters. Things like that are going to be really relevant here. So you need to make sure that you have a list of all of the settings and all of the places and all of the characters that are going to be important for this arc so you can easily reference it whenever you need to. Descriptions and personalities, voices, races, appearances, everything that you want to make sure you keep consistent and can reference easily should be included in either the same document as your session outline or in a different document that you can reference easily. We're going to talk a lot more about this later on, so you don't have to do everything right now, but I would suggest at least listing the names of the places and people that are going to be important so that you have that handy when we start fleshing it out later. All right, so between now and the next session, I would advise taking some time to write out all of the story beats that are going to be relevant for your entire first arc. This is probably going to be a lot of them. I would typically expect a first arc that's about 5 to 6 sessions to have upwards of 30 or even 40 beats depending on the kind of arc that you're running. I'm going to be doing the same as well because a lot is going to happen in the town of Kesset, regardless of player input. There's going to be all sorts of conflicts that occur. The king is going to return looking for his payment. There's a lot that is going to take place for sure, and then there are some things that I'm pretty confident are going to happen as well. So I want to make sure that I list out all of these beats in advance so that I can break them down into sessions and add scenes to them pretty easily later on. Additionally, having all of these beats listed is going to make it really easy for me to improvise in the event that we reach the end of a prepared session earlier than I originally expected. So I would really advise you to take some time, sit down, write out a complete list of all of the story beats you want to take place within your first arc, and then be prepared to break those down into these sessions and add scene details to them later on. Thank you so much for taking the time to check out this post. I really hope that you got something out of it, and I really hope that the resources I provided are going to make it easier for you to outline and plan your sessions. I know that if I'd had something like this when I was first starting out as a dungeon master, I would have had a much easier time keeping track of really complex plot threads and story arcs. I'm glad that I now have enough experience to have developed some efficient methods for creating campaign arcs that I can now share with other people and hopefully give them a much easier time when it comes to preparing for their upcoming sessions and story arcs. If you would like to support me, please consider subscribing to this YouTube channel. That would be the best method right now. Additionally, you can follow me on social media. I am on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter as @TLBainter, with Instagram being my most active if you would like to interact with me. On this YouTube channel, I don't just post content that is about giving advice like I am right now with this tabletop campaign series, but I also post story reviews and even some personal vlogs if either of those categories would interest you. Otherwise, next Monday is going to be the release of the next video in this Homebrew campaign series. Thank you for your time. I appreciate your support, and until the next video, bye.